For the longest time, I thought my wife, Emma, and I had a solid marriage. We'd been together for 7 years and married for 4, and while things weren't always perfect, I thought we had a bond that could weather anything. We didn't have kids yet, but we'd been saving for a house and talking about starting a family soon. Everything seemed fine, until her friend, Ryan, came into the picture. Ryan was a longtime friend of Emma's. I didn't know him well, but they'd met in college and had kept in touch over the years. He was married to a woman named Danielle, but their relationship was rocky at best. I knew because Emma often mentioned how Ryan vented to her about it. "He's going through a lot," she'd say, scrolling through her phone. "Danielle isn't exactly easy to deal with." At first, I didn't think much of it. Ryan and Danielle were their own problem, and I trusted Emma to keep healthy boundaries. But when Ryan's marriage finally imploded, things started to change. It happened suddenly. Ryan showed up at our house one evening, looking like a wreck. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed, and he was carrying a single duffel bag. "Danielle kicked me out," he said as Emma ushered him inside. "I'm so sorry, Ryan," she said, her voice full of sympathy. "You can stay here for a few days if you need to." I stayed silent, biting back the irritation that was bubbling up. I didn't like the idea of him crashing at our place, but what could I say? Emma had already made the offer. The few days quickly turned into a week, then 2. Ryan spent his time moping around the house, barely making an effort to get back on his feet. Emma, on the other hand, doted on him like he was a wounded puppy. I tried to bring it up a few times, but Emma always brushed me off. "Ryan's going through a tough time," she'd say. "The least we can do is be there for him." It was starting to feel like Ryan was more her priority than I was. One night, I came home from work to find them sitting on the couch, laughing over a bottle of wine. The sight of them hit me like a punch to the gut. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Emma looked up, smiling. "Just trying to cheer Ryan up. He's had a rough day." I forced a smile and walked into the kitchen, my mind racing. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something about the way they were acting didn't sit right with me. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing more subtle changes in Emma's behavior. She seemed distracted, her phone always glued to her hand. She'd laugh at texts and quickly lock the screen when I walked into the room. When I asked her about it, she brushed it off. "Ryan's just venting," she'd say. "It's nothing to worry about." But I was worried. Ryan's stay dragged on, and with every passing day, my frustration grew. Emma kept insisting it was temporary, but temporary was starting to feel like a permanent arrangement. It wasn't just Ryan's presence that bothered me. It was how Emma acted around him. She was different. Lighter, more animated. She'd laugh at his jokes in a way that felt off. When we were alone, she was quieter, distant even, as though her attention was elsewhere. One Friday evening, I came home earlier than usual and found Emma and Ryan in the kitchen. She was cooking dinner, and he was standing close, too close, leaning against the counter. When I walked in, they both froze for a split second before Emma forced a cheerful smile. "You're home early," she said, her voice a little too bright. "Yeah," I said, setting my bag down. "Figured I'd call it a day." Ryan muttered a quick hello before slipping out of the room, leaving Emma and me alone. "What's up with him?" I asked. Emma shrugged. "He's just feeling down. I told him he didn't have to put on a brave face all the time." I didn't respond, but the unease that had been brewing inside me grew stronger. The real red flag came a few days later. Emma left her phone on the couch while she went to shower, and a notification popped up. I wouldn't normally invade her privacy, but something about the message caught my eye. It was from Ryan. "Last night was amazing. Thank you for being there for me." My stomach dropped. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, my mind racing. What the hell did that mean? When Emma came back, I confronted her. "Care to explain this?" I asked, holding up her phone. Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw panic flash across her face. Then she quickly recovered, rolling her eyes. Jake, it's not what you think, she said, grabbing the phone from my hand. He's just talking about our conversation last night. He was really upset, and I stayed up with him. Staying up with him isn't what it sounds like, I said, my voice tense. This doesn't feel right, Emma. She sighed, shaking her head. You're being paranoid. Ryan's going through a tough time, and I'm just being a friend. That's it. Her words sounded convincing, but her tone didn't. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the message, her reaction, the way she'd brushed off my concerns. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that she was just being kind to an old friend. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. A few days later, I decided to talk to Chris, my closest friend, about everything. We met up for drinks, and I laid it all out, the message, the late nights, the way Emma and Ryan acted around each other. Chris listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with every detail. Jake, he said finally, I hate to say it, but this doesn't look good. You think she's cheating? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I think you need to find out for sure, he replied, before this eats you alive. That night, I resolved to get to the bottom of it. After my conversation with Chris, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my gut any longer. I needed answers. That week, Emma's behavior only added to my suspicions. She was glued to her phone even more than usual, and when I tried to peek over her shoulder, she'd immediately lock the screen. I decided to take matters into my own hands. The following Friday, Emma told me she was going out for drinks with some coworkers. I won't be out late, she said casually, grabbing her bag. Something about the way she said it felt rehearsed, like she'd been practicing how to sound normal. I smiled and nodded, but the moment she left, I started planning. About an hour after she left, I texted Chris. Can you help me with something? Within 30 minutes, Chris was at my place, and we set up a plan. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but I couldn't live in the dark any longer. We got in Chris's car and drove to the bar Emma had mentioned. I scanned the crowd as we parked, but there was no sign of her. She's not here, I muttered, my chest tightening. Maybe she's at another spot, Chris said, glancing at me. Or with Ryan, I said grimly. The thought alone was enough to make my blood boil. Ryan had finally moved out a few days prior, but that didn't mean their connection had ended. Chris and I drove by Ryan's new apartment. The lights were on, and Emma's car was parked out front. I felt my stomach drop. Jake, Chris said cautiously, are you sure you want to do this? I need to know, I replied, my voice firm. We parked a little down the street, and I walked up to Ryan's door, my heart pounding with every step. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard muffled voices inside, Emma's voice, unmistakable, and footsteps approaching the door. When Ryan opened it, his expression went from confusion to panic in an instant. Jake, he stammered. What are you doing here? Before I could answer, Emma appeared behind him, her face flushed and her hair a mess. She froze when she saw me, her eyes wide with guilt. What the hell is this? I demanded, my voice shaking with anger. Jake, I can explain, Emma began, stepping forward. No, I snapped. You don't get to explain. You lied to me. You've been lying to me this whole time, haven't you? She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned and walked back to Chris's car, leaving her and Ryan standing in the doorway. The drive home was a blur. Chris didn't say much, which I appreciated. I didn't want comfort or advice, I just wanted to process what I'd seen. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with, had betrayed me. And not just with anyone, with someone we'd both let into our home. When I got back, I sat in the dark living room for hours, replaying everything in my head. The signs had been there all along, but I'd ignored them, clinging to the belief that Emma wouldn't do this to me. But she had. And now, there was no going back. The morning after catching Emma at Ryan's, I woke up to a string of texts from her. Jake, please come home so we can talk. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. It was a mistake. One mistake. Don't throw everything away over one night. The messages were relentless, each one more desperate than the last. I ignored all of them. By the afternoon, Emma showed up at the house. I heard her key turn in the lock, and within seconds she was standing in the living room, her eyes red and puffy from crying. Jake, she said softly, her voice trembling. Can we talk? I stared at her, my anger bubbling just below the surface. What do you want me to say, Emma? That it's fine? That I'll just forget what you did? It was a mistake, she said quickly, stepping closer. I was drunk, and I wasn't thinking straight. It didn't mean anything. I laughed bitterly. Drunk? That's your excuse? You're telling me you accidentally ended up at Ryan's place? Her face twisted in frustration. I was just trying to be there for him, Jake. He's been through so much. And you thought sleeping with him would help? I snapped, cutting her off. Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for the right words, but nothing came out. I shook my head, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me. You didn't just cheat, Emma. You lied to my face. You made me feel like I was crazy for suspecting anything while you were sneaking around with him. I wasn't sneaking around, she said defensively. It only happened once. Do you think that makes it better? I yelled, my voice cracking. Do you honestly think that changes anything? Her tears started flowing again, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Jake, she said, her voice breaking, I love you. I made a mistake, but it doesn't mean I don't love you. You don't love me, I said coldly. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the reality of what she'd done hanging heavy in the air. Finally, I spoke. I want a divorce. Her eyes widened in shock. What? Jake, no. We can work through this. People make mistakes. Not this kind of mistake. I interrupted. There's nothing left to work through, Emma. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. She broke down, sobbing into her hands, but I didn't waver. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and paperwork. I reached out to Heather, a divorce lawyer Chris had recommended, and started the process of ending my marriage. Heather was calm and efficient, walking me through every step of the process. You're doing the right thing, she said during our first meeting. It's not going to be easy, but you'll come out stronger on the other side. Her reassurance was a small comfort in the middle of the storm. Emma, meanwhile, refused to accept that it was over. She kept showing up at the house, begging me to reconsider. Jake, please, she pleaded one evening. We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away because of one mistake. You threw it away the moment you walked into Ryan's apartment. I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I'm done, Emma. There's nothing left to say. She finally left, her sobs echoing down the hallway as she walked out the door. That night, I sat alone in the house that had once felt like a home. The silence was deafening, but for the first time, it felt like the start of something new. I wasn't just ending my marriage, I was reclaiming my life. Filing for divorce was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but once the papers were signed and served, a strange sense of clarity washed over me. For so long, I'd been trapped in a marriage I thought was unshakable, only to realize it had been built on lies. Now I could finally move forward. Emma didn't make it easy. After receiving the divorce papers, she showed up at my door again, holding the envelope in her trembling hands. Jake, you can't do this, she said, her voice breaking. Please, let's talk. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. We've already talked, Emma. You made your choices. Now I'm making mine. I'm sorry, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I'll do anything, counseling, therapy, whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us. It's not about giving up, I said firmly. It's about knowing when something's broken beyond repair. She broke down right there on the porch, but I didn't falter. It wasn't my job to fix her mess anymore. Over the next few weeks, Emma's attempts to reconcile turned into anger. She started posting cryptic messages on social media, painting herself as the victim. Sometimes people give up on you when you need them most. Love means forgiveness, but not everyone knows how to give it. Mutual friends began reaching out, some siding with her, others with me. The ones who really knew what had happened didn't need convincing. They saw through her excuses and understood why I couldn't stay. Chris, as always, had my back. She's just mad because she lost control, he said over beers one night. Let her post whatever she wants. The people who matter will see the truth. His words helped, but it didn't stop the frustration from bubbling up every time I saw one of her posts. Meanwhile, Ryan had disappeared from both of our lives. Word got around that he'd moved out of town, likely embarrassed by what had happened. I couldn't have cared less. He'd proven himself to be a snake, and I had no interest in ever seeing him again. In the midst of all this, I threw myself into work and hobbies I'd neglected during my marriage. Photography became my outlet, a way to channel the anger and sadness that still lingered beneath the surface. I spent hours wandering the city with my camera, capturing moments of beauty and chaos that mirrored my own emotions. It wasn't just an escape, it was a reminder that life went on, even after heartbreak. One weekend, Chris convinced me to join him for a hiking trip. You need to get out of the city, he said. Clear your head. I hesitated at first, but eventually I agreed. The trip turned out to be exactly what I needed. Being surrounded by nature, away from the noise and drama, gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Sitting by the campfire that night, Chris turned to me and said, You're handling this better than most people would, Jake. You should be proud of yourself. I don't feel proud, I admitted. I feel empty. That's normal, he said, taking a sip of his beer. But it won't last forever. Trust me, this is just the beginning of something better. He was right. The days that followed weren't easy, but they were lighter. The weight of Emma's betrayal started to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking back. I was looking forward. The house felt different after Emma was gone. At first, it was suffocatingly quiet, the emptiness a constant reminder of the life we had shared. But over time, that quiet started to feel like freedom. Without her things cluttering the space, I could finally make it my own. The first thing I did was pack up anything that reminded me of her: wedding photos, keepsakes, even her half of the furniture. I boxed it all up and left it in the garage for her to pick up. When she came by a week later to collect her things, it was awkward but civil. She lingered by the door, as though searching for the right words to say. Jake, she started, her voice hesitant. I don't want to rehash this, Emma, I said, cutting her off gently. Let's just move on. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I hope you'll be happy, she said before stepping outside. I hope you will, too, I replied, closing the door behind her. Once she was gone, I threw myself into the process of reclaiming my space. I repainted the walls, swapping out the neutral tones Emma had insisted on for brighter, bolder colors. I bought new furniture, things that felt like me, not like compromises we had made together. Each small change felt like shedding a layer of the past, a step toward becoming someone new. Photography became my anchor during this time. I started taking more risks with my shots, experimenting with angles and lighting in ways I hadn't before. One day, while reviewing my latest photos, I noticed something surprising: my work was getting better. It wasn't just the technical quality, it was the emotion behind each image. The pain and frustration I'd been carrying were pouring into my art, creating something raw and honest. Chris noticed it too. These are incredible, man, he said one evening as we looked through my portfolio. You should think about showing these somewhere. I laughed, brushing off the idea. I'm not that good. Bull, he said, smirking. You're way better than you give yourself credit for. Encouraged by his words, I started sharing my photos online. To my surprise, people responded. Comments and messages poured in, each one more encouraging than the last. Your work is so powerful. Do you do exhibits? This speaks to me in ways I can't explain. Thank you for sharing. For the first time in months, I felt like I had a purpose. Meanwhile, Emma's attempts to contact me gradually faded. I heard from mutual friends that she was trying to piece her life back together, but I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. Ryan, as far as I was concerned, had disappeared entirely. One evening, as I sat in the backyard with Max, my golden retriever, I realized how much lighter I felt. The anger, the heartbreak, the bitterness, they were still there, but they didn't consume me anymore. For the first time since the divorce, I felt okay. With Emma and Ryan firmly in my rearview mirror, life began to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't easy, but every small step forward felt like a victory. Photography became more than a passion, it became a way to reconnect with the world. I started exploring places I'd never taken the time to see before, quiet trails, bustling markets, forgotten alleyways. Each shot I took felt like a piece of myself being stitched back together. One weekend, I signed up for a local photography walk. It was a small group of enthusiasts wandering the city, cameras in hand, capturing whatever caught our eye. That's where I met Heather. She wasn't part of the group, she was just sitting on a park bench, sketching the skyline in a worn notebook. Something about the way she carried herself caught my attention. She looked at peace, lost in her work, and I couldn't resist snapping a photo. When she noticed me, she smiled. Caught me in my natural habitat, huh? Sorry, I said, lowering my camera. You just looked serene. She laughed softly. I'll take that as a compliment. We talked for a while, about art, life, and the little things that inspired us. She was a graphic designer, she explained, but sketching was her true passion. Before I left, she handed me a small card with her contact information. If you ever need a collaborator, she said, look me up. I didn't realize it then, but that brief encounter marked the beginning of something new. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Encouraged by the response to my online portfolio, I started reaching out to galleries and local art shows. To my surprise, one of them responded. Jake Larson, the email began. We've been following your work online, and we'd love to feature you in our upcoming exhibit. I read the message 3 times before it sank in. Me? In a gallery? Chris was the first person I told. Hell yeah, man, he said, clapping me on the back. I told you this would happen. You're on fire. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt genuinely proud of myself. In the midst of all this, Heather and I started collaborating. She helped me design promotional materials for the exhibit, turning my scattered ideas into something polished and professional. You're better at this than I am, I joked one evening as we worked on the project. Team effort, she said with a smile. Our partnership felt natural, easy. There were no unspoken expectations, no hidden agendas, just mutual respect and a shared passion for creating. The gallery opening was a night I'll never forget. Walking into that space, seeing my photos displayed on the walls, surrounded by people who genuinely appreciated my work, it was surreal. Chris was there, of course, along with a handful of friends I hadn't seen in years. Even Heather showed up, offering a quiet thumbs up from across the room. As the night went on, I felt a sense of fulfillment I hadn't known was possible. This was my life now, a life I'd built from the ashes of everything Emma and Ryan had destroyed. Later that evening, as I stood outside the gallery, staring up at the stars, Heather joined me. Big night, she said softly. Yeah, I replied, exhaling slowly. It still doesn't feel real. She smiled. You deserve it, Jake. You've worked hard to get here. For a moment, we stood in silence, the cool night air wrapping around us. Thanks for believing in me, I said finally. Always, she replied, her eyes warm. The gallery opening was a turning point. Walking into that space and seeing my work displayed for the world felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. It wasn't just about the photos. It was about proving to myself that I could move forward, that I could take something broken and build something beautiful out of it. Heather and I kept working together after the exhibit. She wasn't just a collaborator anymore, she'd become a friend, someone I could talk to without hesitation. One afternoon, while we were brainstorming for another project, she turned to me and said, "What's next for you?" "What do you mean?" I asked. "With everything you've been through," she said, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Where do you see yourself in a year? 5 years?" I paused, her question hanging in the air. "I don't know," I admitted. "For so long, my life was about holding everything together. Now, I guess I'm figuring it out as I go." She smiled. "That's not a bad place to start." Over the next few months, opportunities kept rolling in. More galleries reached out, and I started getting invitations to teach workshops and speak at events. It was overwhelming at times, but Chris and Heather kept me grounded. "You're killing it, man," Chris said during one of our usual beer nights. "I mean, look at you. A year ago, you were a mess, and now you're out here living your best life." "Still figuring it out," I said with a laugh. "Yeah, but you're figuring it out in style," he shot back, raising his glass. In the midst of all this, I heard from Emma one final time. It was an email, short and to the point. "Jake, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I know I can't undo what I did, but I hope you find happiness. You deserve it." I stared at the screen for a long time before closing the email without replying. It wasn't out of anger. I wasn't angry anymore. But her words felt too little, too late. I'd already moved on. One weekend, Heather convinced me to join her for a trip to the coast. "It'll be good for you," she said. "Get away from the city, clear your head." The drive was long, but the scenery made it worth it. Rolling hills, quiet beaches, and endless blue skies stretched out before us, a stark contrast to the chaos of my past year. As we walked along the shoreline, camera in hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. "This is amazing," I said, snapping a photo of the waves crashing against the rocks. "Yeah," Heather agreed, her voice soft. "It really is." For a moment, we stood there in silence, the sound of the ocean filling the space between us. That evening, as we watched the sunset from a small bluff overlooking the water, Heather turned to me. "You've come a long way, you know," she said. "I guess I have," I replied, smiling. "And you're just getting started," she added, her tone full of quiet certainty. Her words stayed with me. The trip to the coast stayed with me long after Heather and I returned to the city. Something about standing on that bluff, the ocean stretching endlessly before us, had shifted my perspective. For months, I'd been so focused on rebuilding my life, proving to myself that I could overcome the betrayal, that I hadn't stopped to consider what it all really meant. Now I started to realize, it wasn't about what I'd lost. It was about what I'd gained. One evening, as I sorted through my photos from the trip, I came across a shot of the sunset from the bluff. The colors were vivid, golden oranges melting into deep purples, the waves sparkling in the fading light. I printed the photo and framed it, hanging it in my living room. It wasn't just a reminder of the trip, it was a reminder of how far I'd come. Chris noticed the shift in me right away. "You seem different," he said one evening over drinks. "Different how?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Lighter," he said with a grin. "Like you've finally let go of all the crap Emma and Ryan put you through." I thought about his words, letting them sink in. "I guess I have," I admitted. "About time," he said, clinking his beer against mine. Letting go didn't mean forgetting. Emma and Ryan were still a part of my story, but they no longer controlled the narrative. I didn't dwell on what they'd done or the pain they caused. Instead, I focused on what I'd learned. I'd learned to set boundaries, to trust my instincts, and most importantly, to value myself. One afternoon, I got a message from a mutual friend who'd stayed in touch with Emma. "She asked about you," the friend wrote. "Said she hopes you're doing okay." I stared at the message for a moment before typing my response. "Tell her I'm fine. I hope she is too." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, but it was as close as I could get. Meanwhile, my connection with Heather continued to grow. We started collaborating more frequently, combining my photography with her graphic design to create projects that neither of us could have done alone. "You make this easy," I told her one evening as we worked late in her studio. "Because you're easy to work with," she replied, her eyes crinkling with a smile. It wasn't romantic, not yet. But it was real, and it was healthy. That was enough for now. One weekend, Heather invited me to join her and a group of friends for a hike. The trail was challenging, winding through dense forests and steep inclines, but the view at the summit was worth every step. As we stood at the top, looking out over the sprawling valley below, Heather turned to me and said, "This feels like the kind of place you'd photograph." "Already thinking about it," I replied, grinning. She laughed, her voice light and carefree. "You're always thinking ahead." "Not always," I said, glancing at her. That moment, standing at the summit with Heather and her friends, felt like a metaphor for my journey. The climb had been grueling, filled with setbacks and doubts. But the view from the top was breathtaking, a reminder that the struggle was worth it. The hike with Heather and her friends marked a turning point. It wasn't just the view or the sense of accomplishment. It was the realization that I'd finally reached a place where I could think about the future without being tethered to my past. I wasn't just moving forward, I was building something new. Heather and I continued working on creative projects together. What started as a casual collaboration turned into something much deeper. We were a team, not just professionally but personally. One evening, while we were working on a photo book project at her apartment, she asked me, "What's your dream project?" I thought about it for a moment. "I'd love to do a series on resilience," I said. "People, places, moments that represent overcoming hardship. It's something I've been thinking about a lot." Her eyes lit up. "That sounds amazing. You should do it." "I will," I said, smiling. That conversation stuck with me, and over the next few weeks, I began planning the series. I reached out to people I'd met through the photography walks, friends who'd been through their own struggles, and even strangers who'd shared their stories online. Each photo in the series became a testament to resilience, to the ability to rise above pain and rebuild. The project wasn't just about the people I photographed. It was about me too. The series gained traction quickly. Local galleries expressed interest, and I started receiving messages from people who wanted to share their own stories. Chris, as always, was my biggest cheerleader. "This is next level, man," he said, scrolling through the photos on my laptop. "You're not just taking pictures, you're creating something meaningful." "That's the goal," I replied. "And to think," he added, grinning, "all of this came out of that dumpster fire of a marriage." I laughed, shaking my head. "Guess some good came out of it after all." As the series grew, so did my connection with Heather. Our friendship had always been easy, but lately, there was something more. It wasn't something we talked about, it was just there. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, we ended up sitting on her balcony, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the city lights. "You know," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I'm really proud of you." "For what?" I asked, genuinely curious. "For everything," she replied. "For picking yourself up, for taking risks, for creating something that matters." Her words hit me harder than I expected. "Thanks," I said quietly. "I don't think I could have done it without you." She smiled, and for the first time, I let myself imagine what life might look like with her in it. The gallery opening for the Resilience series was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Walking into that space, seeing the photos displayed alongside the stories behind them, was overwhelming in the best way. People came up to me throughout the night, sharing how the photos had impacted them, how they'd found hope in the faces and moments I'd captured. It was more than I'd ever dreamed of. Toward the end of the evening, Heather found me standing by one of the photos, a shot of a young woman standing in a field, her arms outstretched as the wind blew through her hair. "It's my favorite," she said, nodding toward the photo. "Mine too," I admitted. She looked at me, her expression soft. "You did something incredible here, Jake." For the first time, I believed her. That night, as I stood on my own balcony, staring out at the city, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The pain of Emma's betrayal and Ryan's deceit no longer consumed me. I'd taken that pain and turned it into something meaningful, something that could help others and remind myself of my own strength. This was my life now, built on resilience, creativity, and connection. And for the first time, I was excited about what came next. The success of the Resilience series opened doors I hadn't dared to imagine before. Offers started coming in, not just for gallery showcases, but for collaborations, interviews, and even a potential book deal. It was exhilarating but overwhelming. For so long, I'd been focused on surviving, and now that I was thriving, it felt almost surreal. Heather remained a steady presence through it all. She wasn't just my creative partner, she was my sounding board, my voice of reason, and increasingly, the person I looked forward to seeing at the end of every day. One evening, after a particularly chaotic day of planning for an upcoming exhibit, we found ourselves back on her balcony, sipping wine and unwinding. "Do you ever stop?" she asked, grinning at me over the rim of her glass. "Not lately," I admitted. "But I'm not complaining." She studied me for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've changed so much since we first met," she said. "How so?" "You're lighter," she replied. "More open. It's like you've finally figured out who you are." Her words lingered in my mind long after I left that night. Around this time, Chris started teasing me about Heather. "So, when are you going to stop pretending she's just your friend?" he asked one afternoon while we grabbed lunch. I rolled my eyes. "It's not like that." "Sure it's not," he said, smirking. "You've been spending half your time with her, and don't think I haven't noticed the way you talk about her." I didn't respond, but his words stuck with me. A few weeks later, Heather and I were wrapping up a project when she turned to me with a smile. "You know, we make a pretty good team," she said. "We do," I agreed. She hesitated for a moment before adding, "I think we'd make a good team outside of work too." Her words caught me off guard, but I didn't need time to think. "I've been feeling the same way," I admitted. The smile that spread across her face was enough to make my chest tighten in the best way possible. We took things slowly at first, either of us wanting to rush into something new. But as the weeks turned into months, our connection deepened. With Heather, everything felt easy. There were no hidden agendas, no manipulations, just honesty and mutual respect. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As my relationship with Heather grew, so did my confidence. I started taking on bigger projects, stepping outside my comfort zone in ways I never would have before. One of those projects was a mentorship program for young artists, something I'd been passionate about for years but had never pursued. Helping others find their voice through art reminded me of my own journey, how far I'd come, and how much more I still wanted to achieve. Chris, of course, had plenty to say about it all. "Look at you," he said one evening over drinks. "You've got a booming career, a great girl, and you're helping people. You're like a whole new person." "Not new," I said, smiling. "Just better." For the first time in what felt like forever, I could look at my life and feel genuinely proud of what I'd built. The Resilience series had evolved into something much bigger than I'd ever anticipated. It wasn't just a collection of photos anymore, it was a movement. People from all walks of life reached out to share their stories, and I felt deeply connected to the community that had grown around the project. I started hosting events where people could come together, share their experiences, and celebrate their ability to overcome hardship. Seeing strangers connect through something I'd created was humbling in the best way. Heather was by my side through it all, offering support, advice, and the occasional reality check when I got too wrapped up in my work. "You don't always have to be everything for everyone," she said one evening as we worked late in my studio. "I know," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "But I feel like I owe it to them." "You've already given so much," she said, her voice soft. "Now it's time to let yourself enjoy what you've built." Her words hit home. That weekend, Heather and I took a spontaneous trip to the mountains. It was her idea, a way to unplug and reset after weeks of non-stop work. We rented a small cabin and spent the days hiking, taking photos, and simply being present. One morning, as we stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking a valley blanketed in mist, Heather turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "What do you think you'd be doing right now if everything with Emma hadn't happened?" she asked. I considered her question, letting the quiet stretch between us. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "Probably coasting through life, pretending everything was fine." She nodded. "And now? Now I feel alive," I said, a smile tugging at the corners of my lips. "Like I've finally found my purpose." She smiled back, and for a moment, the world felt perfectly still. As the months passed, my life continued to grow in ways I never expected. The mentorship program became a cornerstone of my career, giving young artists the tools and confidence to pursue their dreams. One of my ments, a teenager named Maya, showed incredible promise. Her work was raw, honest, and deeply moving. Seeing her progress reminded me why I'd started this journey in the first place. "You're going to do amazing things," I told her after one of our sessions. "So are you," she replied, grinning. At home, Heather and I began blending our lives in small but meaningful ways. She moved some of her things into my place, and I found myself carving out space for her in ways that felt natural, not forced. It wasn't about replacing Emma or erasing the past. It was about creating something new, something better. Chris, ever the jokester, couldn't resist commenting on my transformation. "Remember when you thought your life was over?" he asked during one of our beer nights. "Vividly," I replied with a laugh. "Now look at you," he said, raising his glass. "Living the dream." "Here's to better days," I said, clinking my glass against his. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. Looking back, I never would have imagined that Emma's betrayal would be the catalyst for so much change in my life. It was a moment that shattered me, but in the shards, I found pieces of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost. The road to get here wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like giving up, when the weight of anger and sadness felt unbearable. But every step I took, no matter how small, brought me closer to the life I was building now. One evening, as I sat on the couch flipping through a photo book Heather had made of my resilience series, I found myself thinking about the man I used to be. The Jake who had once been so consumed by betrayal and heartbreak felt like a stranger now. I wasn't that man anymore. The anger that had once fueled me was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of pride. I had taken everything Emma and Ryan had tried to destroy and turned it into something beautiful. That night, Heather came over with a bottle of wine and a look of quiet excitement. "I have something for you," she said, pulling a small, wrapped box from her bag. "What's this?" I asked, grinning as I took the package. "Just open it," she said, sitting down beside me. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages thick and blank. "For your next project," she said, her eyes warm. "I thought it might help you start planning." I ran my fingers over the cover, touched by the thoughtfulness of her gift. "Thank you," I said, leaning over to kiss her on the cheek. "You're welcome," she replied, her smile widening. Later that evening, as Heather dozed off beside me, I opened the journal and began jotting down ideas. The Resilience series had been about others, about the strength and beauty of people overcoming hardship. This time, I wanted to explore something more personal. What did it mean to truly heal? To let go of the past and embrace the possibilities of the future? The more I wrote, the clearer it became. This new project wasn't just about art. It was about closure. In the weeks that followed, I started piecing together the concept. The series would be called After the Storm, a reflection on the journey from pain to peace. It would include not just photographs but also essays, poetry, and other forms of expression. Heather jumped in to help, offering ideas and connections that brought the project to life. "You've got something special here," she said one evening as we reviewed my notes. "I hope so," I replied, smiling. As the project grew, so did my sense of purpose. It wasn't just about creating art, it was about connecting with others, sharing stories, and reminding people that they weren't alone in their struggles. For the first time, I felt like everything I'd been through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the anger, had a purpose. One weekend, while Heather and I were hiking in the woods, I paused to take a photo of the sunlight filtering through the trees. She stopped beside me, watching as I adjusted the settings on my camera. "What do you see?" she asked. "Hope," I replied, snapping the shot. She smiled, slipping her hand into mine. That moment, standing there with Heather, felt like the culmination of everything I'd been working toward. The storm was over, and I was finally ready to step into the light. With the After the Storm project well underway, life settled into a rhythm that felt both exciting and grounded. Each day brought new challenges, but they were the kind I welcomed, creative, purposeful, and entirely my own. The project began to take on a life of its own. Submissions poured in from people all over, stories of heartbreak, resilience, and rediscovery. It became a collaborative effort, a testament to the human spirit and its ability to endure. Heather played a big role in shaping the project. She wasn't just supportive, she actively pushed me to think bigger, to trust my instincts and let my work reflect the person I'd become. One evening, as we worked late in my studio, Heather leaned back in her chair and said, "You know, Jake, this isn't just a project anymore. It's a movement." I smiled at her, setting my camera down. "I never thought it would turn into something like this." "That's because you don't give yourself enough credit," she replied, her eyes twinkling. Her words stayed with me. The exhibit for After the Storm was set to debut at one of the city's largest galleries. It was a massive leap from anything I'd done before, and the anticipation was equal parts exhilarating and nerve-wracking. Chris, as always, was there to keep me grounded. "You're going to crush it," he said as we grabbed drinks the week before the opening. "I hope so," I replied, swirling the beer in my glass. "No, seriously," he said, leaning forward. "Look at what you've done, Jake. You've taken something awful and turned it into something incredible. That's more than most people could ever do." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "Thanks, man. I wouldn't have gotten here without you." He grinned. Yeah? You can thank me with tickets to the VIP section." The night of the exhibit felt like a dream. The gallery was packed, filled with people who had been following the project and those who were seeing it for the first time. Walking through the space, seeing the photos and stories displayed so prominently, was overwhelming in the best way. Heather stood by my side, her quiet confidence a steadying presence. "You did this," she said softly, gesturing to the room around us. "We did this," I corrected, smiling at her. Toward the end of the evening, I found myself standing in front of one of my favorite pieces, a photo of sunlight breaking through storm clouds over a quiet lake. It wasn't the most dramatic shot in the series, but to me, it represented everything I'd been working toward: hope, peace, and the promise of something better. Heather joined me, slipping her hand into mine. "What's next?" she asked, her voice gentle. I looked at her, then back at the photo. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But for the first time, I'm excited to find out." The morning after the exhibit, I woke up to a flood of messages. Friends, family, and even strangers reached out to share how much the After the Storm project had meant to them. It was humbling, to say the least. What started as a way for me to process my pain had grown into something so much bigger, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, we are not alone. That afternoon, Heather and I went back to the gallery to see the exhibit in the quiet. Without the crowd, the space felt different, still and contemplative. As we walked through, she stopped in front of the same photo I had lingered on the night before, the sunlight breaking through the clouds. "It really does look like hope," she said softly, echoing the words I'd said during our hike. I smiled. "That's because it is." Later, we sat in a small cafe across the street, sipping coffee and reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" Heather asked. "All the time," I admitted. "It's strange. I used to think Emma and Ryan destroyed me, but looking back, they just gave me the push I needed to change." She nodded. "Sometimes the hardest things in life turn out to be the most important." "Exactly. I said, setting my cup down. I wouldn't wish what happened on anyone, but I wouldn't trade where I am now for anything. As the weeks passed, I continued to work on After the Storm and other projects that grew from it. The momentum didn't stop, but I no longer felt like I was rushing to prove something to myself. I had already proven it. One evening, I sat on my balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. Max, my golden retriever, lay at my feet, his soft snores filling the quiet. I thought about Emma and Ryan, not with anger, but with acceptance. Their betrayal had hurt me in ways I couldn't have imagined, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it had been the catalyst for a life I never thought I could have. A life filled with creativity, connection, and the quiet joy of knowing who I was and what I wanted. Heather joined me a few minutes later, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "Deep in thought?" she asked, handing me a cup. "Just thinking about how lucky I am," I replied. She raised an eyebrow. "Lucky? After everything you've been through?" "Yeah," I said, smiling. "Because I didn't let it break me. I found my way through, and now I get to build something better." She leaned against me, her presence warm and steady. "You've come a long way, Jake." "We both have," I said, wrapping an arm around her. As I sat there, the tea warming my hands and Heather by my side, I realized something important. The storm was over. And the life I was living now wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. It was about hope, love, and the endless possibility of what came next.